Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. Story 1. Echoes in the Void. I awoke to a deafening silence. The air felt thick, as if the world had paused just to listen. My alarm clock blinked 7 a.m., but there was no buzzing, no cars passing by, no chatter from the street. I reached out for my phone, hoping to find some explanation, but it was dead. The usual hum of electricity in the house was gone, replaced by an eerie calm that made my skin crawl. Stepping out of bed, I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed through the empty halls, met with nothing. The house was exactly as I left it the night before, but something was fundamentally wrong. The absence of life was palpable, like a void that had swallowed everyone up. As I wandered through each room, the creeping realization set in. Everyone had vanished. My family, my neighbors, the entire town. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. I made my way to the front door and swung it open, half expecting to find some answer on the other side. Instead, the world outside was a mirror of the emptiness inside. Cars were parked neatly along the street, doors left ajar as if their owners had simply walked away. The morning sun cast long shadows, but not a single soul walked beneath them. It was a ghost town, but without the ghosts. Or so I thought. I wandered through the town, searching for any sign of life. Stores were open, but the shelves were untouched. The local diner had food on the tables, still warm to the touch, as if the patrons had just stepped out. Yet, there was no one. My footsteps echoed ominously in the deserted streets, the only sound in this forsaken place. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation, that I couldn't be the only one left. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, doubt gnawed at me with a cold, relentless grip. Nightfall brought with it an even deeper dread. The world outside my door was pitch black, the streetlights flickering as if struggling against some unseen force. I locked myself inside, bolting the doors and windows, a feeble attempt at security. It was then that I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps, shuffling along the corridor outside my bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest, the noise growing louder, closer. They were deliberate, a steady rhythm that seemed to mock my fear. "Is someone there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my racing pulse. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. I strained to hear, every muscle in my body tense, but there was nothing. Minutes felt like hours, stretched thin by the weight of my dread. I stood frozen, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. But the only response was the relentless ticking of the clock, counting down the moments of this nightmare. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, unable to sleep. The footsteps returned, circling my room, a maddening loop that went on for hours. I didn't dare move, terrified of what I might find if I did. My mind raced, searching for answers in the dark. Was this some kind of prank? A dream? Or had I truly awakened to a world where I was the last soul left, haunted by the echoes of those who once were? The hours crept by, the footsteps never ceasing, a constant reminder of the void that had swallowed everything and everyone. Morning arrived with the same oppressive quiet, but the footsteps from the night before still echoed in my mind. I dragged myself out of bed, eyes bleary and body heavy from a sleepless night. The sunlight felt artificial, as if it was trying too hard to convince me that everything was normal. But the silence was deafening, louder than any sound I had ever known. Determined to find answers, I ventured outside once more, feeling like a ghost drifting through a world that had forgotten it existed. The town was unchanged from the day before, still trapped in a frozen moment. I walked past the church, its bells silent, the graveyard behind it eerily untouched. The air felt thick with something unspoken, a tension that clung to my skin. As I turned a corner, I spotted a familiar figure, Mrs. Thompson, the librarian. Relief flooded my veins, but as I approached, my heart sank. She was as still as a statue, her eyes wide open but vacant, staring at nothing. I reached out to touch her, but as soon as my fingers brushed her shoulder, she crumbled to dust, leaving only her empty clothes behind. Panic gripped me. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. What was happening? Was I going mad? I raced through the town, finding more and more of these strange, lifeless figures. All of them were frozen in place, as if captured in their last moments. Each one crumbled to ash at the slightest touch. It was as if the world had turned into a macabre museum, each person a relic of a forgotten life. The weight of it all was crushing, the realization that I was truly alone, surrounded by echoes of the past. I found myself drawn to the old abandoned house on the edge of town. It had always been a place of mystery, rumored to be haunted by the spirits of those who once lived there. In my desperation, I hoped to find some clue, some explanation for the nightmare that had become my reality. The house loomed before me, its windows dark and empty, like eyes staring into my soul. I hesitated at the threshold, the air around me growing colder. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. The interior was a relic of a bygone era, filled with dusty furniture and faded photographs. It felt like stepping into a different time, a place untouched by the chaos outside. As I wandered through the rooms, I felt a strange familiarity, as if I had been here before. My hand brushed against an old mirror, and for a moment, I saw not my reflection but that of a young woman, her face twisted in terror. I blinked, and she was gone, replaced by my own pale, frightened visage. The air grew colder still, and I could hear faint whispers, words I couldn't quite make out, but they sent chills down my spine. In the dim light, I noticed a staircase leading to the basement. The door was slightly ajar, a thin beam of light spilling out. My heart pounded as I descended, each step creaking under my weight. At the bottom, I found a small, dimly lit room. In the center was a table, and on it, a dusty old book. The air was thick with a musty smell, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding me like a shroud. With trembling hands, I reached for the book and opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols and drawings, a language I couldn't understand. But one thing was clear, the people of the town were trapped in a curse, one that had somehow spared me. Just as I began to process this revelation, the whispers ceased, replaced by a single voice, clear and sharp. "You are not alone," it said, cold and menacing. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. The temperature dropped further, and I could see my breath in the dim light. Suddenly, the door to the basement slammed shut, trapping me in darkness. My heart raced as the voice continued, "They are watching. They are waiting." The room seemed to close in on me, the air thick with the presence of something unseen. Panic surged through me as the darkness pressed in, thick and impenetrable. I fumbled for my phone, the only source of light I could think of, but it was dead just like everything else in this forsaken town. The room felt like a coffin, and I was trapped inside. The voice continued, echoing in my mind, "They are watching. They are waiting." My skin prickled with the sensation of being observed, every hair standing on end. It felt like 1,000 eyes were upon me, unseen but all too real. I groped around the basement, searching for any way out. My fingers brushed against cold, rough stone, and then something soft, a curtain. I yanked it aside, revealing a small, boarded-up window. Desperation gave me strength, and I tore at the boards, splinters digging into my skin. Finally, with a loud crack, the last board gave way, and I squeezed through the narrow opening. I tumbled out into the cold night, gasping for breath. The air was crisp, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. I staggered away from the house. The town wasn't just deserted, it was cursed. The book in the basement had hinted at a ritual, a way to seal away the spirits of the town's former inhabitants. But something had gone wrong, trapping everyone in a ghostly limbo. I was the only one left unaffected, or so it seemed. As I walked through the dark streets, the sound of my footsteps echoed eerily, reminding me of the unseen presence I couldn't shake. The moon hung low in the sky. The once familiar streets now felt alien, filled with an oppressive energy that made my skin crawl. I knew I had to find out more, to understand what had happened. The voice had said they were watching, but who were they? And why was I the only one left? My thoughts raced, the questions swirling in my mind like a storm. The town was a labyrinth of secrets, each corner hiding another piece of the puzzle. As I made my way back to my house, I felt the familiar dread settling in. The night had been filled with strange occurrences, but nothing compared to what awaited me at home. I stood at my front door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. The house was dark, the air inside heavy and still. I crept through the halls, every creak of the floorboards setting my nerves on edge. I could feel the presence of something, lurking just out of sight. The atmosphere was suffocating, thick with an unspoken threat. I reached my bedroom. The door was ajar, and as I pushed it open, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the middle of the room, was a figure. It stood with its back to me, cloaked in shadow. My heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I took a step forward, and the figure began to turn, slowly revealing a face that was both familiar and foreign. It was me, my own face, twisted in horror, eyes wide with fear. The mirror image me spoke, its voice a chilling echo of my own. "You are not alone," it whispered, its eyes locking onto mine. "They are coming." I stumbled back, my mind reeling from the sight of my doppelganger. The figure slowly dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind a cold, empty space. My pulse thundered in my ears, each beat a reminder of my isolation in this cursed town. The room felt darker, the walls closing in. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting. I knew I couldn't stay here. I needed to find answers, to break whatever spell had ensnared everyone. With a sudden resolve, I grabbed a flashlight and headed back out into the night. My breath fogged in the chilly air as I made my way to the center of town. There, the old town hall loomed, a relic of a forgotten era. The building had always felt like the heart of the town, and now it seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. I pushed open the heavy doors, the creak of the hinges echoing in the vast, empty space. The inside was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight streaming through broken windows. Dust particles danced in the air, illuminated like ghostly apparitions. I ventured deeper into the building. The corridors twisted and turned, each one feeling more like a maze. Finally, I found myself in the town's old records room. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty ledgers and forgotten histories. I rifled through them, searching for anything that might explain the curse. My hands shook as I pulled out a particularly old, leather-bound volume. The cover was embossed with a strange symbol, one I had seen in the book from the abandoned house. I found references to an ancient ritual, one meant to protect the town from an unseen evil. But something had gone wrong. The text spoke of a pact, a deal made with a dark force to seal away the spirits of the town's ancestors. The ritual had been botched, trapping not only the spirits but the living as well. My blood ran cold as I realized the full extent of the disaster. The ritual had locked everyone in a limbo, leaving me as the only one who could potentially break the curse. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. I was plunged into darkness, the temperature dropping rapidly. The air grew thick with the whispers of countless voices, indistinct but filled with anguish. My heart raced as I felt an icy hand brush against my arm. I spun around, the room seemingly alive with shadowy figures, their eyes glowing with a ghostly light. They closed in, their whispers growing louder, more desperate. "Free us," they chanted, their voices merging into a cacophony that rattled my bones. I clutched the book and ran, the figures trailing behind me. Their cold presence nipped at my heels as I sprinted through the labyrinthine corridors. The town hall seemed to warp and twist, its hallways stretching into infinity. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, their pleas echoing in my ears. As I reached the entrance, I felt a sudden pull, as if the building itself were trying to drag me back. I fought against the force, bursting through the doors into the night. Outside, the figures of the townspeople appearing like phantoms. They stood silently, their eyes fixed on me, waiting. In the center of the square, a circle of stones glowed with a faint, eerie light. It was the ritual site, the place where it had all gone wrong. The book in my hand seemed to pulse with energy, a dark force urging me to complete the ritual. As I stepped into the circle, the air grew thick with anticipation. I knew what I had to do, but the question lingered. Was I truly the one to break the curse, or had I been brought here for a darker purpose? The book fell open to a page covered in ancient symbols. My heart pounded as I recited the incantation, the words foreign but powerful. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the air crackled with energy. The spirits around me began to wail, their voices rising to a deafening crescendo. The circle glowed brighter, blindingly white, and I felt a surge of power flow through me. Just as I thought the ritual was complete, a terrible realization struck me. The ritual wasn't to release the spirits, it was to contain them. And as the light engulfed me, I understood that I had become the final seal, the last sacrifice to an unending curse. The last thing I saw was the town returning to normal, the townspeople reanimated and moving as if waking from a long dream. But for me, the world faded into darkness. My final thought was of the footsteps, the ones that would forever echo in the halls of my mind, as I joined the voices in the void, trapped in a limbo of my own making. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Encroaching Shadow. I stepped into the apartment, the kind with creaky wooden floors and intricate moldings whispered tales of the past. The landlord, an eccentric old man named Mr. Henderson, had been adamant about one thing: the painting in the living room was to stay. "It's part of the deal," he said, his eyes twinkling with a hint of something I couldn't quite place. I didn't mind the painting at first. It was an old, somewhat faded portrait of a woman in a long, dark dress standing in a gloomy forest. Her eyes seemed to follow me around the room, but I chalked it up to the artist's skill. I was more interested in settling in and making the place my own. It wasn't until the third day that I noticed something odd. The woman in the painting seemed closer. Her once distant figure was now noticeably larger, her features more defined. Am I imagining things? I muttered to myself. I decided to take a photo of the painting with my phone, just to have a reference. When I compared it to the image from the day before, there was no doubt she had moved. It was subtle, but unmistakable. I tried to brush it off as a trick of the light, but an uneasy feeling gnawed at me. Days passed, and the woman's progression became more apparent. Her eyes, once hollow and distant, now bore into mine with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. I found myself avoiding the living room, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Each night, I would hear faint whispers, like someone softly calling my name. I decided to confront Mr. Henderson. He lived just a few floors up, and I knocked on his door with a sense of urgency. When he answered, he seemed expectant, as if he knew why I was there. "It's the painting, isn't it?" he asked before I could speak. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. He invited me inside. "There are things about this building, about that painting, that you need to understand," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Henderson revealed that the painting had been in the building for over a century. The woman in the portrait was believed to be Isabella, a widow who had died under mysterious circumstances. Some said she was murdered by her lover, others whispered that she took her own life in a fit of despair. Her spirit was said to be bound to the painting, forever seeking release. "She latches onto the living, trying to find a way out," he explained, his eyes wide with fear. "Once she fixates on someone, she won't stop until she has them." I realized with horror that Isabella had chosen me. I returned to my apartment, my mind racing with thoughts of how to rid myself of the cursed painting. But as I opened the door, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The woman in the painting was now mere inches from the frame's edge, her outstretched hand seeming to reach for me. Panic surged through me as I backed away, but something in her eyes held me captive, a dark promise of what was to come. Sleep eluded me that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, Isabella, with her cold, piercing gaze and her hand inching ever closer. The whispers grew louder, more coherent, and I began to make out words among the hisses and murmurs. "Help me," they pleaded, but there was an underlying menace that made my skin crawl. I decided to research Isabella's history. The local library had archives dating back centuries, and I spent hours poring over old newspapers and records. Isabella had indeed been a real person, her tragic tale documented in faded ink. She was a young widow, left alone after her husband perished in a tragic accident. Her grief turned to madness, and she isolated herself in their home until one fateful night when she vanished without a trace. Her body was never found, but her portrait, painted by her late husband, was left behind. I stumbled upon an old article about a series of mysterious deaths linked to the painting. Each victim was found in their home, eyes wide open in terror, their hearts stopped as if from sheer fright. The painting was always present, and each time, Isabella's figure had moved closer to the foreground. The pattern was undeniable, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was next. Desperation drove me to consult with a local historian, Mrs. Whitmore, who specialized in the paranormal. Her eyes widened when I mentioned the painting. "You need to get rid of it," she warned. "Isabella's spirit is trapped, and she's using the painting as a conduit to the living. But be careful, simply removing it won't be enough. Her hold on you is already strong." Mrs. Whitmore suggested a cleansing ritual. It required rare herbs, candles, and a recitation in Latin. I gathered the materials and returned to my apartment, feeling a mix of hope and dread. The whispers had intensified, and the air was thick with a malevolent presence. The painting now dominated the living room, Isabella's hand nearly breaking the frame's boundary. As I prepared the ritual, the temperature dropped, and an oppressive silence fell over the room. I lit the candles, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The scent of burning herbs filled the air, and I began the recitation, my voice trembling. Liberare animum tuum, Isabella, et dimit numbers. Free your soul, Isabella, and release us. The room shook violently, and a deafening roar filled my ears. The painting seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, and Isabella's face twisted in fury. Her hand reached out, and for a moment, it felt as if icy fingers were wrapping around my throat. I gasped for breath, the words of the ritual faltering on my lips. Just when I thought I would succumb to her grip, a blinding light erupted from the candles, and a piercing scream shattered the air. When the light faded, the room was still. The painting lay on the floor, its frame cracked and the canvas torn. Isabella's figure was gone, leaving only an empty forest. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I bent down to inspect the painting, a cold breeze swept through the room, and I heard a familiar whisper, more menacing than before, "This isn't over." In the days that followed the ritual, I tried to convince myself that it had worked, that Isabella's spirit was finally laid to rest. The painting, now devoid of her image, was relegated to a corner, covered by a sheet. But the unease lingered, a persistent itch at the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sleep was impossible. I tossed and turned, the whispers echoing in my head. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, I rose from bed and walked to the living room. The painting seemed to pulsate with a life of its own, the once empty forest now filled with dark, shadowy figures. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the figures were moving, slowly advancing towards the frame's edge. A knock at the door startled me out of my trance. It was Mr. Henderson, looking more disheveled than ever. "I've been hearing things," he said, his voice trembling. "I think she's back." His words sent a chill down my spine. If even he, with his years of dealing with the apartment's dark history, was frightened, what chance did I have? We decided to seek out Mrs. Whitmore again, hoping she might have another solution. She welcomed us into her cluttered home, her face grave as we recounted the recent events. "The ritual was only a temporary fix," she said. "Isabella's spirit is too powerful. We need to find her remains and give her a proper burial." We combed through historical records, trying to pinpoint where Isabella might have been buried. The clues led us to an abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of town, forgotten by time. Under the cover of night, armed with flashlights and shovels, we ventured into the darkness. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the air heavy with decay. We searched for hours. Just as we were about to give up, Mr. Henderson's flashlight caught something, a small, weathered headstone, barely legible. The name Isabella was etched into the stone, along with a date that matched our records. We began to dig. As we unearthed the coffin, a sense of foreboding washed over me. We pried it open, revealing Isabella's skeletal remains. I placed a rosary in her bony hands, whispering a prayer for her soul. Suddenly, the ground trembled, and a bone-chilling wail pierced the night. The shadows around us seemed to come alive, swirling and converging on the open grave. In the chaos, I felt something cold and solid clamp around my ankle, dragging me down. I screamed for help, but my voice was drowned out by the howling wind and Isabella's vengeful cries. Darkness closed in, and I realized with horror that this was far from over. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.